for showing up on a rainy night with possible tornado warnings. I also want to thank the library very much for sponsoring this, Paige Hurst for putting this all together. They say the key to a good speech is to have a good beginning, a good ending, and to keep them as close together as possible. And tonight I promise you 2 out of 3. And to get started, I want to show you what I think is my good beginning. This is a public service announcement from the British equivalent of our Food and Drug Administration.
Certain foods are high in saturated fat. This is the average amount of saturated fat a person consumes in a month. If you eat too much of this, then over time fatty deposits could build up in your arteries, and this increases your risk of heart disease. If saturated fat can clog this pipe, imagine what it's doing to yours. For ways to cut down, visit the Eat Well website. If you want the facts on food, we're the standard.
Well, I don't know about you, I learned some interesting scientific facts from that announcement. I learned, for instance, that saturated fat is a liquid in a cold refrigerator, then becomes solid in a room temperature pipe. This, of course, explains why when you want to make ice, you pull the water out of your freezer and put it on the counter until the cubes are formed. I also learned I should never inject saturated fat directly into my coronary arteries, especially if they're at room temperature. Most importantly, I learned any food that clogs your drain pipe will also clog your coronary arteries. This, of course, made me very anxious to figure out what other foods will clog my coronary arteries. So I hired a couple of research assistants, and we conducted a series of experiments. We soon realized that bread will clog your coronary arteries. Apples and bananas will clog your coronary arteries. Brussels sprouts will clog your coronary arteries, although the blockage is not as severe if you cook them first. We learned that from a consultant we brought in to fix the lab equipment. Eventually, we discovered that pretty much everything you eat will clog your coronary arteries, with the exception of chocolate ice cream. Because you can wash that down with a little hot water. My advice to you, if you want to avoid heart disease, base your diet on chocolate ice cream with hot water. Now, would you all agree that my experiment there was based on solid scientific principles? Don't flatter me, of course they weren't. That was ridiculous, that was bad science. What I hope to convince everybody here tonight is that for 50 years we've been operating under this belief that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. What I hope to show you is that from the very beginning, that belief was based on bad science. I also hope to show you that the advice that grew out of that belief not only has not made us any healthier, it ultimately led to the rise in diabetes and this epidemic of type 2 diabetes and obesity that we see today. So I'm going to be saying that this whole thing was based on bad science. So to get started, I just want to talk briefly about good science versus bad science. And I know you had this in high school, but let's take a quick review. What makes a good scientist? A good scientist, first and foremost, tries to be objective. Now, when he's conducting research, he almost certainly has a theory in mind, but his ultimate goal is to find the truth. That means he's going to be open to alternate theories. He'll consider all the evidence, and this is hugely important, it's why it's in red. If he sees solid evidence that does not support his theory, he will conclude that his theory is probably wrong. Because in good science, a theory is not considered valid unless the evidence supporting it is consistent and repeatable. There was a famous science philosopher named Karl Popper who called this the black swan test. If your theory is that all swans are white, your obligation as a scientist is to look for black swans. If you don't find any, your theory might be valid, but as soon as you or anyone else starts spotting black swans, your theory is no longer valid. And it doesn't matter how many white swans you can point to, your theory is not valid because it is not consistent. That's how a good scientist thinks. Now, a bad scientist doesn't think this way. Bad scientists typically have big egos. They fall in love with their own theories. Consequently, when a bad scientist conducts research, his ultimate goal is to prove that he is right. That means he will ignore alternate theories, he'll ignore the contrary evidence, or find a way to explain it away. In other words, if you show a bad scientist a black swan, he will explain how it is either not a swan or not black. And if he's a truly bad scientist, he'll commit the biggest sin of all, which is perform mathematical magic on his own data to produce the results he wants. Does anybody think that never happens? Good. Now let's talk about the kind of studies that our good and bad scientists might be conducting. In fields like health and medicine and nutrition, studies are going to fall into one of two categories: observational studies and clinical studies. Now, an observational study is by far the most common type, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We are simply observing people. We're not treating them. In other words, we're not giving them a drug. We're not putting them on any kind of a diet. We are just observing them and gathering data. Now, what we hope to find if we gather the data are traits, behaviors, and results that seem to occur together. If they do occur together, we will say they are statistically associated or correlated, or very often in media stories you'll simply see that referred to as linked. Now, if two traits are linked, if they're associated, we should be able to plot the data on a chart and show, for instance, that smoking is associated with a higher rate of lung cancer, or taking estrogen is associated with a lower rate of heart disease, or going bald is associated with wanting to own a red convertible. Not quite as much research on that one. 90% of the time that you're reading the newspaper and you see a headline like this, egg intake is linked to diabetes risk, you're looking at the results of an observational study. Now, there's a huge problem with observational studies, which I'm going to demonstrate by giving you an example. If I were to do a 5-year observational study on the men of Williamson County, I could prove to you absolutely positively the size of a man's bald spot is correlated with the onset of heart disease. Now, if the bad scientists or the bad media reporters got a hold of that, that would lead to this, which 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 would lead to this. Now, does anybody here think male pattern baldness actually causes heart disease? No, but the two are associated. Why? Because as men get older, they are more likely to lose their hair, and they are more likely to develop heart disease. What we're looking at there is the variable that the investigators did not look for. That happens all the time, and it's called a confounding variable. Observational studies are full of confounding variables, and if the researchers aren't thinking about them and not looking for them, they won't spot them. If I asked you all right now, go out to the street and spend 5 minutes out there, count the number of Toyotas that drove by, you'd be able to come back and give me an accurate number, right? Then if I said, well, how many Buicks went by? You'd have no idea, because you weren't looking for them. That is the problem with observational studies. That is why the good scientists have a saying, correlation does not prove causation. When good scientists want something they're willing to consider proof, they conduct the other kind of study, a clinical study. Clinical studies are the gold standard. They're the only kind that really matter. Why? Because you can control your variables. In a clinical study, we will take 2 large groups of people and we'll make sure they're balanced for things like age and race and gender and their previous health history, socioeconomic status, everything we can think of, right? And that's obviously important, because if I wanted to test, say, the effect of a drug on heart disease, and I've got one group of people, it turns out they're full of smokers, and the other group isn't, we know the smokers are going to screw up the data. So we want to keep these groups as statistically balanced as possible, and then we change one variable. That one group may take a drug while this group takes a placebo. Neither group knows what they're taking, or one group will go on a diet, the other group won't, or they'll go on 2 different diets. And now, because we controlled every other variable except one, if these groups end up with a significantly different outcome, we know the difference is probably due to that one variable. Is that clear? Good enough. Now, I want to give you an example of why good scientists don't jump to conclusions based on observational studies. For decades, there's been an observational study going on called the Harvard Nurses Study. Thousands of women involved. And one of the associations they pulled out of that study some years ago was this. Middle-aged women who took estrogen had a 40% lower rate of heart disease. Now, based on this, the bad scientists and some bad doctors were ready to run out and start prescribing estrogen to every middle-aged woman in the country. The good scientists said, now wait a minute, correlation does not prove causation. We need to conduct a clinical study. So they did. Major clinical study, 16,000 women involved. It lasted for 5.5 years. Here was the result. Women who took estrogen ended up with a 30% higher rate of heart disease. They also had more strokes. There was another clinical study, same result. There was a clinical study with men and estrogen, same result. Estrogen turned out to be harmful. Now, how could this be? If estrogen's not reducing heart disease, why would a large a large observational study show us that women who took estrogen had a lower rate of heart disease? Can anybody guess? There was a great big confounding variable called health consciousness. The women who were taking the estrogen were taking it because they believed it was good for them, and these were women who cared about their health. Health conscious women are different. Health conscious people are less likely to smoke, they're less likely to drink too much, less likely to consume sodas and candy and other forms of junk. They're more likely to exercise, to get enough sleep, to take their vitamins, and to go see their doctor if something is wrong. In other words, the estrogen was not making those nurses healthy, but the health conscious nurses were far more likely to take estrogen. And their better health habits more than offset what turned out to be the negative effects of taking the estrogen. Now that's why I said there's a problem with observational studies, because in observational studies, this phenomenon happens all the time. Health-conscious people will naturally gravitate toward what they're told is good for them. They will tend to stay away from what they are told is bad for them. And in doing that, they can create statistical associations that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual effectiveness of the product. So that leads to the question, how much bad science is actually out there? It just so happened, as I was working on this speech, this article appeared in the Atlantic. Dr. John Ioannidis has spent his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science. Dr. John Ioannidis is not only a Harvard MD, he's a mathematical genius, and he likes to go through studies and find the flaws. I want to give you some quotes from this article. It's very important. He and his team have shown again and again in many different ways that much of what biomedical researchers conclude in published studies, conclusions that doctors keep in mind when they prescribe blood pressure medication, or when they advise us to consume more fiber or less meat, is misleading, exaggerated, and often flat out wrong. He charges that as much as 90% of the published medical information that doctors rely on is flawed. When it came to cancer, heart disease, and other common ailments, there was plenty of published research, but much of it was remarkably unscientific, based largely on observations. There's that word again. 80% of non-randomized studies, those are observational studies, turn out to be wrong. Researchers were frequently manipulating their data analyses, chasing career-advancing findings rather than good science, and even using the peer review process to suppress opposing views. So, with all that in mind, let's take a quick look at heart disease in America, and we'll see some truly bad science in action. Now, believe it or not, 100 years ago, most doctors